Brookings, Oregon, January 1990. Storm number 3 had just passed. The fog hung low like a wound that wouldn't close, clinging to the jagged cliffs of Devil's Backbone. People assumed the weather would wash everything away. But that morning, when a fisherman named Cal Miller cast his net near the edge of the rocks, he saw something rising from the icy water. Not a fish, not driftwood, but a decayed police patrol car, its roof rusted through, rear tires tangled in long strands of seaweed, and the license plate belonged to Evelyn Price. She had been the first female officer in the town of Brookings, who vanished without a trace during a night patrol in 1970. The department ruled it a voluntary disappearance due to stress, but no one really believed that. Her husband, Daniel Price, also a cop, resigned after the case was shelved and never spoke to the press. 13 years passed. No body, no second investigation. But now the car had surfaced, and in the trunk. No human remains, just 3 discharged bullets and a bone fragment that didn't belong to Evelyn. People once asked Daniel why he didn't keep looking for her. He said, "Because if she was alive, she wouldn't want to be found, and if she was dead, then someone out there didn't want me to know the truth." Today, he's come back, and this time, he's not turning away. Brookings, Oregon, morning of January 9, 1990. Daniel Price descended into the basement of the police department where he had worked for 16 years. He didn't bring a warrant. He didn't inform anyone. But no one stopped him. Archive Room 4 sat behind 3 steel doors, no cameras, no posted guards, and no one bold enough to go down there unless ordered. Daniel had stood here once before, in 1977, when Evelyn vanished. Back then, he was temporarily relieved of duty due to emotional instability. They said he was too close to be objective. This morning, he returned alone to see what had been buried in the 13 years since. The file labeled E0477 rested neatly on a middle shelf. New label, smooth folder, clean pages. Inside were 12 sheets administrative memos, internal conclusions, and a copy of Evelyn Price's resignation letter. No scene photos, no medical reports, no witness statements from the 3 neighbors who lived near the cliffs. All that remained was a handwritten note in red ink on the last page. Reclassified, personal disappearance, file permanently closed, WK. WK stood for Wallace Kerrigan Deputy Chief at the time, and the same man who had personally removed Daniel from the investigation in 1977. But Daniel remembered clearly the original file wasn't 12 pages. He himself had typed over 58, including internal memos, incident sketches, and preliminary interviews. All gone. As he prepared to leave, Daniel noticed an unmarked cardboard folder tucked inside the patrol vehicle inspection files. Inside were 7 black and white aerial photos, edges curled, unnumbered. Each image showed a different angle of Devil's Backbone, the cliff where Evelyn's car had been recovered. In the 5th photo, someone had circled a tiny object in red pen. When Daniel held the picture closer under the light, he saw it, a police badge. Tilted, resting between 2 rocks, positioned almost exactly where Evelyn's car had emerged 13 years later. That detail was only possible if Evelyn had been dragged to the cliff's edge or if someone had been standing there, watching. But why weren't these photographs in the official record? And why had only one man stood on that cliff the night Evelyn vanished? Daniel knew his name, and he knew exactly where to go next. This time he wasn't Evelyn's grieving husband. This time he was the last man alive who remembered what the original truth looked like. Wallace Kerrigan lived at the end of Florence Court, more than 11 miles from the Brookings police station. After retiring in 1983, he never left town, never sold his house, never changed his name. He didn't have to. He knew that human memory only lasted as long as people kept asking questions, and in Brookings, people had stopped asking about Evelyn Price a long time ago. But Daniel hadn't. He stood at Kerrigan's door at 6:47 a.m., holding the photograph of the badge lying between the rocks. Kerrigan opened the door after just 2 knocks, no surprise, no hesitation. He looked older, his eyes dim, but still wore his BPD retired cap. No greetings. Daniel handed him the photo, pointing directly at the red-circled spot. Kerrigan glanced at it, then said with a voice that sounded rehearsed for 13 years, "I remember that place." No denial, no lies. He invited Daniel in, poured 2 cups of black coffee. On the table lay the local newspaper, headline reading, "Patrol Car Rises from Ocean Evelyn Price Case Reopened." Kerrigan folded it shut. He said, "I knew you'd come." Daniel didn't react. He asked one question. "That night, who was the last person to speak with Evelyn?" Kerrigan answered without pause, "Me." Then silence. A silence that wasn't guilt, but confirmation. Daniel placed the coffee down and slid over the gutted case file. Kerrigan didn't look at the papers, he looked Daniel in the eye and said, "If you want answers, ask the right question." Daniel replied, "I don't want answers, I want the original memory." Kerrigan stood, disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he held a small wooden box. Inside was a worn black notebook, its corners frayed. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward Daniel. "I wrote everything down after that night, because I knew one day someone wouldn't believe me." Daniel opened the first page, written in blue ink, firm handwriting. Evelyn knew something. She asked the wrong person, at the right time. And at the bottom, scrawled faintly in pencil, "She wasn't killed for being a cop, she was erased for refusing to bow." Daniel looked up. Kerrigan stared back, red-eyed but steady. "I didn't push her, but I turned away, and I let others do the rest." He didn't name names, but Daniel already knew. And in his mind, the first name that surfaced wasn't a murderer. It was a former colleague. The one who swapped shifts that night. The one person not listed in the case file. The one Evelyn once called the man I don't trust. On the patrol schedule for October 1977, one name appears only once on the night Evelyn disappeared. The old carbon paper log, triple-layered and fading, clearly reads, "Night Shift 2300, Josevenhouderen, Price, Andrews." Daniel had stared at that name 100 times. Andrews James T. Andrews, a junior patrol officer, entered the force a year after Evelyn, had never once been assigned a shift with her before that night. Reason for pairing, unknown. On every duty roster from 1976 through mid-1977, there wasn't a single shared shift between Evelyn and Andrews. There was no written request for a switch, no documented substitution, and Andrews transferred out of Oregon 3 weeks after Evelyn vanished. Stated reason for leaving: relocation due to family concerns. No internal review, no exit interview, and no evaluations in his personnel file. Daniel called the police department in Tucson, Arizona, where Andrews was supposedly reassigned in 1978. They had no record of a James T. Andrews, no officer from Oregon, no matching badge number. The trail stopped cold in Brookings the night Evelyn disappeared. Daniel returned to the Brookings station, quietly entering the auxiliary records room, the one that held personal equipment archives. He found a box labeled J.T. Andrews. Inside were a technical logbook, a rusted flashlight, and a single unlabeled microcassette. Daniel took it home and played it in his old cassette reader. After a long hiss of static, a man's voice came through, hoarse, speaking like he was leaving a reminder to himself. 11:50 p.m. Handed off car 17 to Evelyn. She said she'd swing by checkpoint B3 before clocking out early. I told her I'd handle the rest. She didn't look at me, just said one thing: "If I don't come back, remember one thing for me." The tape cut out. No continuation, no context for the one thing. But Daniel knew one fact for sure. Car 17 was Evelyn's assigned vehicle. And that night, car 17 never returned to the lot. It spent 13 years beneath the cliff face. Andrews didn't just switch shifts. He was in the car. And now, He was gone, as if he'd never existed. When a man vanishes from administrative records, there are usually two possibilities. Either someone hid him, or he knew how to erase himself from the system. With James T. Andrews, Daniel wasn't sure it was voluntary. He began tracing the smallest fragments, not through police files, but through tax records, vehicle registrations, and archived state census logs. And there, he found a near match. James Timothy Reed, who had lived in Brookings in 1975 and moved to Crescent City in 1978, perfectly aligned with the timeline of Andrews' disappearance. A name change. A second life. Daniel didn't call. He drove straight to Crescent City, a quiet coastal town further south where time seemed to sit still. The listed address led to a private fish hatchery in the woods, nearly 10 kilometers from the town center. A low wooden house, windows sealed with faded duct tape, and 2 security cameras mounted awkwardly like someone who used to wear a badge but didn't want to be seen ever again. Daniel knocked 3 times. No one answered. He left behind a photocopy of the photo, the badge between the rocks at Devil's Backbone, with a handwritten message on the back. If you won't talk to me, someone else will start asking. At exactly 3:00 a.m. the next morning, Daniel's phone rang, a man's voice low and urgent. I didn't kill her. I only did what I was told. They told me to switch shifts. I didn't ask why. I took the orders from the office, not the patrol team. She said if anything happened to her, I had to remember this. I made copies, more than one. If I disappear, your name will be the first they mention. The voice paused, then continued. I thought I was sent there to monitor. 15 minutes in, I realized I was there to be absent. When I returned to the station at 2 a.m., her car wasn't there, and no one asked why. The next day, I was reassigned. 3 weeks later, I changed my name. A year after that, I stopped believing in justice. The call ended. No apology, no plea. Daniel didn't go back to sleep. He reopened Kerrigan's black notebook, turned to page 7, where a faint pencil line read, She said, I'm not afraid of being killed. I'm afraid the truth will die before I do. And in the margin, the substitute never has to file a report if he was never really supposed to be there. No one knew exactly what Evelyn Price had kept, not in her files, not in her desk, but Daniel remembered one thing vividly. A week before she vanished, Evelyn had told him, If I don't come back, don't look for who killed me. Look for who I trusted. At the time, he thought it was a joke, a complaint, maybe stress talking. But today, he believed it was a message coded and intentional, meant for him alone. Daniel returned to the old house they had once shared, long since sold to an elderly couple who had no idea of the home's history. But Daniel knew they hadn't touched the attic. With a quiet request and some cash, he climbed the creaking wooden stairs. The floor still groaned beneath his feet. On the left wall, there was a crack one only Evelyn had ever noticed. When he gently pried the wood aside, he found a small metal box bolted into a beam. Inside were 3 cassette tapes, an old iron key, and a sealed envelope. Tape 1, dated 1976, was a recording of an internal meeting. Evelyn was questioning her superior. Why is a man accused of assaulting a minor being transferred instead of investigated? The voice that responded was male. You need to understand your limits. This isn't something a frontline officer should be digging into. Tape 2, unlabeled, was a conversation between Evelyn and a woman. The woman's voice trembled, clearly afraid. He said if I talked, my daughter wouldn't be safe. I gave the medical file copy to Evelyn. She promised to keep it quiet. I can't go to the police. He is the police. Tape 3, dated October 2nd, just 3 days before Evelyn's disappearance, was Evelyn's own voice. I've backed everything up. 3 locations. One of them is off the grid. If I go missing, someone will find it. And if no one comes looking, then I was wrong to think Daniel still cares. Daniel didn't finish the tape. He sat in the attic for over an hour, holding the key in his hand, wondering what it unlocked. Under dim light, he opened the envelope. Inside was a short, handwritten letter, written in slanted, delicate script. If you found this, then I was right to believe I wasn't alone. I don't need revenge. I need to be remembered for not being silent." And at the bottom, one cryptic line, "Box D14, Morley Storage, Crescent City." A rental storage unit. An iron lock that had waited 13 years, and maybe what Evelyn really hid wasn't evidence. It was the memory of someone who no longer had the right to tell their own story. Morley Storage sat on the edge of Crescent City, tucked against the western tree line. No signage. Just a long row of metal containers lined up like coffins, hand-carved unit numbers, rusted padlocks, and a lone guard booth with no one inside. When Daniel arrived, the sun had just set. Streetlights hadn't flickered on. No one was behind him. He stopped at Unit D14 at the far end of the row, beneath a dying pine tree. The iron lock was nearly corroded through, but still held. Daniel used the key Evelyn left behind. The door groaned more than just age. It was the sound of something that had waited too long to be found. No shelves, no boxes. Just a single steel suitcase placed in the center of the bare cement floor. And a faded photo taped to the front Evelyn, in plain clothes, sitting beside a young girl Daniel didn't recognize. Inside the suitcase were 5 VHS tapes, a black leather notebook, identical to the one Kerrigan had kept, a thick file folder containing letters, psychological reports, X-rays, and internal memos. Daniel played one of the VHS tapes using the old projector that had been left in the unit. The footage was grainy, dated September 1976. Evelyn was interviewing a 15-year-old girl, her voice barely audible, eyes cautious and unfocused. "I don't remember what happened in that room. I just remember the light, and the man who gave me the bottle of water. Every time I passed out, he'd repeat, 'You won't remember anything.'" Daniel didn't need to watch more. He knew this wasn't just about internal misconduct. This was mind control, psychological manipulation, and Evelyn had tried to expose it on her own. The black notebook listed 3 names, no titles, no job descriptions. But next to each name was a handwritten note. "He smiled when I asked. Signed the order to transfer her. Acted like he'd never met the victim." All 3 had worked at the Brookings Police Department, and in the final section of the folder was a half-torn resignation request. Evelyn's handwriting scrawled across the bottom, "I'm asking to leave the force before the force erases me from myself." Daniel left the storage unit carrying a bag of records. He didn't call the police. He called Marie, the only former colleague who had ever believed Evelyn without question. When they met, Daniel placed the suitcase on the table without saying a word. Marie looked at the first tape, her hand suddenly trembling. "This girl," she whispered. "Her mother came to the station once and was turned away." Daniel looked directly at her. "We always thought Evelyn died because she knew too much. But maybe she stayed alive as long as she did because she hadn't given this to anyone yet." It took them 3 days to sort through everything Evelyn had left behind. Daniel and Marie, 2 people once forced out of the department for lack of cooperative spirit, now sat together in a locked room, opening each document like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. The black notebook held 42 pages. Evelyn had written every word by hand, sparing no line. There were no narratives, no emotion, just raw data, dates, names, repeated behaviors. She didn't list victims. She listed observers, the ones who signed off on transfers, the ones who falsified locations, the ones who weren't present when they were supposed to be, and none of them had ever been held accountable. Daniel found a spreadsheet Evelyn had drawn up herself. The heading faintly penciled in, "Unexplained Memory Interruptions, Brookings, PD, 1974 to 1977. There were 19 names, all teenage girls, aged 14 to 17, each brought in for unrelated minor charges, curfew violations, runaway reports, suspected drug use. 11 were later transferred schools. 4 had documented psychiatric treatment. 2 were listed as self-inflicted accidental deaths. 1 had no record remaining in any system. Marie whispered, Evelyn wasn't investigating a crime. She was investigating silence. Daniel played the fourth VHS tape. Evelyn was seated directly in front of the camera, eyes locked on the lens as if speaking to someone in the future. I no longer believe in procedure. I no longer believe we're a protective system. I think I'm just a cog in a machine that buries the truth beneath lost paperwork. But I believe that if someone, someday, reads everything I leave behind, then maybe those girls won't remain just numbers. Marie gripped Daniel's hand as the tape ended. Beneath the camera was a folder of photographs, 19 blurred faces, all bearing the same vacant expression, exhausted, disoriented, and as if they couldn't remember who they were. In a separate file, Evelyn had written, I once asked, why was the same officer assigned to transport 6 girls to the detention center in just 3 months? Why are there no hallway surveillance records from the 2nd floor? And why is it that every time someone like me starts asking, we're advised to take early leave due to mental health concerns? Marie didn't need more proof. She opened her laptop and cross-referenced press clippings with the names Evelyn had left. Within an hour, they found 6 fragmented news stories, all reporting unusual accidents, possible poisonings, or missing after exiting rehab. Every article ended with the same line, no signs of foul play. Daniel stared at those words like unsigned verdicts. Evelyn wasn't killed for what she knew, he said quietly. She was killed because she was the only one who ever dared rewrite the official reports. Daniel sent copies of the full archive to 3 places. A retired journalist who once wrote about Evelyn, a lawyer who had defended victims in a similar case out of state, and a civilian watchdog group that preserves dismissed police records. He attached no names, no explanation, just one line. I don't need to be believed. I need someone to read to the last page. Marie said nothing. She resigned from her teaching job at the local high school and deactivated every account she had. 1 week after the first leak, the newspaper received a formal request to halt publication for public safety. The story was pulled. The documents were marked under verification. No victims were named. All locations were abbreviated, and Evelyn Price's name remained only in a sidebar footnote. Former officer reported missing. That night, Daniel found an envelope on his doorstep. Inside was a copy of his own death certificate, unsigned, unfiled, but fully completed, including his full name, date of birth, and a scheduled date of death, 3 days from now. He wasn't afraid. He was only disappointed in how easily they erased a person's existence, not with a bullet, but with font. The next morning, he drove out to the cliffside where Evelyn's car had been recovered, Devil's Backbone. Not to jump, not to mourn, but to remember the last time he saw her standing beside her patrol car, the wind lifting her hair, turning toward him and saying, You know, if I'm ever gone, then the place I once stood has to be cold enough that no one walks forward unless they truly believe. Daniel stood there the entire morning, until a small child passed by, holding her father's hand, and pointed to the old faded plaque. The first woman in town to ever become a cop. Nobody remembers her name anymore. And Daniel smiled, because someone was still telling the story. In 2003, an independent journalist named Rachel Kim received an unmarked package. Inside were a VHS tape, a black leather notebook, and a handwritten note. She wrote, they erased, but ink doesn't wash in cold water. The investigation began quietly. Rachel followed the trail of deleted reports, missing names, and systemic gaps, and gradually uncovered that between 1974 and 1982, there had been at least 27 cases of unexplained memory loss, 13 sudden departmental transfers, and 9 unresolved deaths, all under the oversight of the same cluster of officers operating along Oregon's coastal corridor. In 2005, the first draft of a long-form article titled The Evelyn Price Files was completed. But days before it could be published, the outlet Rachel worked with was hacked, their internal servers wiped clean. No backup copies remained. In 2000 Bay, the civilian oversight group that had received Daniel's documents officially stated that the materials lacked sufficient legal foundation to initiate prosecution. Evelyn Price was never posthumously honored. Daniel Price died in 2011. His death certificate signed by the same official who reviewed Evelyn's case in 1977. Marie relocated out of state and has not appeared publicly since. Bündig. In 2019, a high school student in Portland mentioned Evelyn Price during a class presentation on early female law enforcement officers. When the teacher asked, "Where did you find that name?" he replied, "From an old box left on our porch. It had a photo inside, and a note that read, 'If you're reading this, she's been remembered.'"